This is the second panel today. The title of this panel is How Can Decarbonization Lead to Stronger Rural Communities? Now, rural communities and Iowa agriculture producers have major challenges and opportunities from climate change and from policy responses to deal with climate change, such as soil carbon sequestration, initiatives for low carbon ethanol, low carbon ammonia, and other environmental and ecosystem services from climate smart and regenerative agriculture. A critical issue as agriculture producers improve their practices in response to market demands is verification. This panel is going to talk about all these issues, including opportunities, emerging technologies, and key challenges in decarbonizing the agricultural sector. Moderating the discussion is my colleague, Mark Linderman, who's a faculty member in the Department of Geographical and Sustainable Sciences, and he'll be introducing himself and the panel shortly. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Jerry. Yes, hello, thank you for joining us. My name is Mark Linderman. I am here in the Department of Geographical and Sustainability Science at the University of Iowa. Thank you for joining us for our second session of this workshop. Just to give you a little bit of background, we have had a previous meeting on this particular topic. And as a result of that, our discussions have definitely broadened. Not just to focus on carbon, but it has definitely grown to broader greenhouse gases, ecosystem services, and how it relates to rural communities and identifying some of the opportunities and benefits that are associated with that. Today, we have a great panel. We have a few people online, one person there at the summit. First of all, we have Debbie Reed, who is apparently in the airport at the moment. So she is the Executive Director of Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. We also have Stephen Hall, Associate Professor from Iowa State in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology, doing some ecosystem services and ecosystem science work. Also joining us is Alejandro Plastina, Associate Professor from Iowa State University and Department of Economics, also works in Extension. We also have Emily Zimmerman, Iowa State Assistant Professor, Department of Natural Resources Ecology and Management, Global Resources Systems Program. And we also have finally, but not lastly, is Andrew Johnson, Executive Director of Clean Energy Districts of Iowa, but also, if I'm not mistaken, a third-generation farmer as well in Northeast Iowa. So thank you all for coming. Just to give you a little background in terms of how we're hoping to kind of organize this panel. I do have a list of questions that I'll be posing that we've come up with to our panelists just to get the discussion going. After which, if we have any questions, or even during, if you have questions and if you want to pose those to the panel, please feel free. So panelists, we're going to go ahead and get started with this topic. Let me start off with asking Stephen maybe just to kind of cap this for us in terms of why not carbon sequestration? Why isn't this the main focus?
Yeah, so I think, a lot of the market-based approaches for dealing with climate impacts of agriculture are really focused on, this phrase carbon sequestration, which I think is really attractive, right? The idea that we can take carbon out of the atmosphere and stick it in the soil. But I think it's really important to keep in mind sort of the whole context of agroecosystems and how they impact climate, right? And in many cases, actually that soil carbon change can be, extremely important, but may not be the dominant lever by which these systems are actually impacting climate. And I think that's really important to consider, not only in terms of the market-based approaches, but also the potential co-benefits and the interactions of sort of climate, water quality, profitability, kind of these other issues that we face here in Iowa.
What are the specific issues in Iowa that we should be discussing then?
Absolutely. And so I think one thing that has gotten neglected a little bit is sort of the disproportionate role of nitrous oxide emissions in controlling the climate impact of our sort of classic corn and soybean agricultural systems. And so Some recent work from our group has shown that if you look at the maximum feasible carbon gain that you might expect from adopting various cropping system practices, if you compare that climate impact versus the ongoing climate impact of sort of business as usual nitrous oxide emissions, actually the N2O emissions can have more than twofold greater impact, right? And so unfortunately, to my knowledge, these have been much less appreciated in sort of the context of the markets, right? The markets may not be providing the incentives necessarily to go after these N2O emissions. A similar story for methane, right? And so because we have such an intensive animal agricultural system in Iowa, we have really substantial methane emissions from manure, right? And so actually tackling those emissions with tried and true practices as well as emerging technologies could really be a strong point of leverage for decreasing our climate impact.
Thank you. Andy, if I could turn to you real quick. You've mentioned that the Farm Bill, as well as certainly other federal programs and organizations, as well as market-based solutions, are feasible in terms of actually being able to compensate farmers for these changes that are being made. But there's also problems, competing types of aspects, duplicative kind of aspects associated with different programs. What are the challenges and opportunities of going this route?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me too. Part of the Farm Bill point that I wanted to make was just to help everyone remind folks, because a lot of folks I'm not sure are as aware of how USDA agencies work. I worked with the Natural Resources Conservation Service for many years. And of course, there is this federal, state, local conservation partnership that exists in every county in the country, and the local arm is the soil and water conservation districts. And so federal policy, as well as state and local policies, get implemented through that partnership. And the partnership is led by technical assistance. It's boosted by financial assistance. So you hear a lot about agricultural subsidies, and the Farm Service Agency is actually the agency that manages most of those subsidies. But there are a lot of dollars that flow through conservation programs. Conservation Reserve Program, many have heard of, EQIP, Conservation Stewardship Program. And the technical people in every county administer those programs, and many of those programs have long paid for conservation benefits. So in a sense, now we're talking about markets around soil carbon or market approaches for other types of ecosystem services. And I'm not negating the value of those possibilities, but also just pointing out that we have this history of paying farmers, at least in part, for ecosystem services, even though we didn't always talk about it and think about it that way. But conservation commodities like reducing soil loss and reducing fertilizer applications have been part of these farm conservation programs for decades, especially going back to more or less the mid-'80s, when our current generation of farm conservation programs came about. And so now those programs have had their challenges too. We don't have perfectly sustainable agriculture. Many folks would say we don't have sustainable agriculture at all. But actually, relative to the alternative, the directions we were going before that, those programs have had some really dramatic impacts. And so then the question does come up, well, if we're talking about things like soil carbon going well beyond where we are at now, what's the role of markets, marketplaces, private sector, so to speak? Are they regulated or voluntary, whatever they may be? And what's the role of the next generation of Farm Bill or other types of federal policies that could pay farmers directly for these conservation commodities, stewardship payments, in more holistic ways, in more effective ways? I'm just noting in a sense that there are a couple of approaches. And then the other piece of it that I wanted to add here, it was mentioned in the intro that verification of soil carbon is a big challenge. Well, verification of nitrogen applications and use is an equally big problem. I can testify to that, having worked in conservation planning, trying to measure and monitor and verify whether farmers are actually applying as much nitrogen or manure or whatever as they say they are. So the verification for soil, though, for example, for soil carbon, we think of often as we have to get out there and test the fields. And we have to test fields now and next year and next year and next year. And if we're paying farmers for soil carbon, X amount per ton or whatever it may be, we have to be directly paying for the outcome. The history of ag conservation programs is a little different. For example, we've been paying farmers to reduce soil loss for a long time, but we don't measure soil loss on every field. We have really good science that says these practices, when implemented correctly, result in, over a landscape level, this much soil loss reduction on average. So it's an average over many farms and fields. But the equations are very specific to soil type and slope length and climate. They bring in all these kind of things. So this point I just kind of want to toss out as part of the conversation too. If we at some point will be paying farmers for additional soil carbon sequestration, whether through farm programs or markets or a combination, I would strongly suggest that we really take hard looks at paying for practices, not paying for outcomes, but paying for practices where we have very good science that demonstrates they will get the outcomes on a landscape scale. And that could be functional for farmers. So sorry. Yeah.
Nope, just jumping in because that leads us perfectly into our next speaker, Alejandro. What are the challenges of, given the federal legacy, given very much a lack of a private market, what are the challenges of getting us moving towards that?
Well, again, thanks for the invitation. I think there are multiple factors that are impeding the development of a strong agricultural carbon credits market. We do have a strong agricultural carbon industry, but not a market yet. So the problem relies in having carbon credits as credence goods. So those are goods which have characteristics that cannot be ascertained by consumers even after consumption, right? So an agricultural carbon credit is a claim that farmers have removed greenhouse gases or have avoided greenhouse gas emissions through changes in agricultural practices. So the credibility of that claim is key for developing the agricultural carbon market. And right now I see three major challenges to the development of a carbon credit market. One is how to assess credit quality. The second is how to assess credit quantity. And the third one is how to deal with carbon reversals. So let me go through each of those one at a time. With credit quality, currently there's a lack of standards in terms of the technical definitions for agricultural carbon credits, and there's a lack of clear and consistent and uniform guidelines for measure, reporting, and verification systems. And with that lack of guidance, it's hard to assess the credibility and the quality of a credit. How do we define additionality, permanence, realness, leakage avoidance, and so on? So we need better guidance in terms of assessing the credit quality. In terms of assessing the credit quantity, we have to understand that contracts with between farmers and carbon programs are signed based on the potential to generate carbon credits, but are paid on the actual number of carbon credits generated, right? Most of the time. We do have a few that pay per practice, but when there's a gap between the potential and the actual amount of carbon credit generated, that means a significant risk for farmers in the revenue, right? In the stream of revenue. So one of the issues is that potential credits are estimated using different models across different programs, and the projections are made at farm level, and they carry high uncertainty because these models tend to work at the landscape level, like it was mentioned recently. So what we have is we do have estimates of the potential for removal of carbon credits, but there's a wide confidence interval around those estimates. And on the flip side, we do have actual credits that are also estimated using pretty much the same models, but now updated with weather, the timeliness of practices, and sometimes soil samples. So the question is, how can a farmer put much trust on those models, since for the farmer, those models are black boxes? And even if we go a step further, how can a farmer dispute the results of the model if they disagree with the estimate of actual credits? That's something that is, it hasn't been addressed right now as of today. I mean, so right now we do have a lack of scientific consensus on the linkages between soil dynamics, agricultural practices, and greenhouse gas dynamics at farm level. We have to work on that. And the third one I mentioned, transparency on how to deal with carbon reversals. So avoidable or unavoidable. We know that farmers discontinue practices because of different reasons. Weather, fire, need to address a specific weed issue, and so on. So how will these carbon programs deal with carbon reversals? And carbon reversals are basically when a practice is discontinued, some of the carbon stored in the soil go back into the atmosphere. And we don't really have good information on what happens to the farmer, what happens to the buyer of the carbon credit, and what happens with the carbon balance in the atmosphere. Who addresses that imbalance between what's promised as an output of these carbon programs and the actual carbon balance? So we need to address that to make agricultural carbon credits credible, not only for farmers, but for society in general.
Thank you, Alejandro. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the need for being able to dispute from a farmer's perspective in terms of what that credit actually is. That's perfect. In terms of some of the questions for Emily, what are these uncertainties, and is it even possible to get to a market system at the farm level?
That's a great question. So again, thank you for inviting me this afternoon. So I think a lot of the uncertainties, Alejandro set me up really nicely. So thanks to Alejandro for that. So the part I want to really focus on is that the second piece of credibility that Alejandro talked about related to quantity. So again, when we think about the data and the models that are being used by these different entities to essentially look at the potential to generate emissions reductions, there's a lot of uncertainty there, right? So when we think about what the data that those models are based on, particularly if we're going to make assumptions or estimations at the field level, the data that are being used are probably from much larger spatial variations, right? So we're getting much wider estimates than in that particular field, what the actual outcome is going to be. So there's a lot of uncertainty around the actual data itself. And then to Alejandro's point, there are all kind of different calculators, models, and planning tools that are being used by different entities that farmers might wish to interact with. And those tools and those calculators vary extensively in their complexity, so in our ability to understand what's going on, in their actual processing and the kinds of data that they may or may not include, and then whether that information is transparent to the actual user or to the farmer themselves. So it becomes really difficult, to Alejandro's point, to understand how those models compare in a particular field, right? So you might use one entity's tool to estimate the potential, and then a different entity's tool to estimate the potential in the same field, and get really widely variable outcomes. So from an uncertainty and a risk perspective, that can be really difficult to evaluate if you're a landowner or a farmer trying to make a decision about how to enter the carbon market. So trying to overcome some of those challenges in terms of data and uncertainty, I think is going to be a really big step, needed step forward if we're going to realize sort of well-developed agricultural carbon markets.
Well, that's perfect to lead into our next speaker, Debbie Reed. Given your work within the organization, you're providing or you're getting into these types of markets. How does ESMC approach this? What's their vision for being able to address this type of uncertainty?
That's a great question. So I've been participating in carbon markets and agriculture since the 90s when they started. And ESMC is really an attempt to take all of those learnings over the past 25 or 30 years and create a market that overcomes the challenges and the obstacles that we saw in generating market opportunities for agriculture. I'll say that there's high demand right now for natural climate solutions, including from agriculture in particular. And I think markets are only one mechanism, right, to achieve the emission reductions. There are other tools, and some of them have been discussed here. But the beauty of markets is they do provide the opportunity for financial incentives to flow to the farmers, depending on how a program is set up. At ESMC, we have set this up so that we have tried to remove all of the risky items that have been well discussed so far here from the market programming, if you will, by developing a national scale infrastructure in investing in tools and technology so that we as an organization are working with experts to utilize the tools, the quantification tools that generate carbon and greenhouse gas credits, as well as we generate water quality, water quantity, and we're starting to develop biodiversity credits. So that's one important point is we've literally since 2018 been investing in improving the tools and technologies that we use, because the more data you feed into them, the less uncertainty associated with them, and the greater the accuracy and the rigor of those tools at scale. So literally, we've been doing programmatic investment. I think it's been pointed out that we have USDA programs, we have the other programs of delivery. The other beauty of markets is because there are standards and rules for how you quantify, how you verify. And based on the level of uncertainty associated with whatever tool or technology you're utilizing, discounts are applied to the amount of credits that are generated, right? So you have to show, to go through a verification process, how accurate your tool is, right? How much uncertainty is associated with data collection? How much uncertainty is associated with your tool, your modeling tool, and then discounts are applied. So the programs do have a way of accounting for this. I would hesitate to say that that level of scrutiny is something we want to show to the producers, right? What we're trying to do is show over time in any given region or production system, what is the capacity for increased soil carbon, reduced nitrous oxide, reduced methane, reduced CO2 from energy utilization, and then build that capacity so that they understand what the potential is. I think the other thing I would say is that while federal programs are very helpful, we have built our program so that we can build on top of these upfront financing tools and technical assistance tools that USDA offers, for instance. The markets offer better quantification so that we can actually know what's moving the needle where, in what place, because there's high temporal and spatial availability or spatial variability associated with all greenhouse gases in all systems. So we really need to know in any given system, in any given region, what is moving the needle and what is not. So the markets, because of the level of rigor we bring to quantification, offer an ability to really figure that out and watch those trend data over time. So I think there's lots of opportunities here, but we've taken the opportunity to just invest in certain tools so that we can improve them over time.
Just to follow up real quick, it was interesting that you were talking about several different ecosystem service markets and payments for each of those. But they're very complementary in terms of management activities and their impacts having across those ecosystem services. Is that something you consider? Is that something that is essential?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's the other thing I learned in these markets. Like I participated in carbon markets for a long time, and then I started working with water quality markets and found out that there was no common community of practice that actually linked the two. And yet the same practices in agriculture that impact carbon and greenhouse gases impact nitrous oxide, for instance, as well as methane, but much more about nitrous oxide. And so we have built our system so that we look at, for carbon and water quality in particular, what are the commonalities for data collection that are utilized to feed the models, because we use one greenhouse gas model and one water quality model. So we collect common data, but then we send them the data to different models for those two impacts. And yet another one for water quantity. We're still working on the biodiversity metrics, but I think the important point that you're hinting on, and that has been brought up, is that we are doing ourselves a disservice by not looking at the systems-based, landscape-based impacts of any activities in any systems, because we could lose the forest for the trees, right? If we don't pay attention to unintended consequences and or consequences there that are synergistic, where we can really try to move the needle.
Certainly, and even thinking about that as a spatial case too, right? Watersheds instead of farms and things like that. So just to move on, Stephen, given all of this, given that there's a lot of interest in a broad array of different types of ecosystem services, where do our priorities need to be, given this new term coming out, climate smart agriculture?
Yeah, and I'll pivot back to some of the uncertainties that Debbie was talking about, and I would add an additional one, and that's the biological uncertainty of how these systems respond, right? And this gets back to the issue that Alejandro raises of permanence of the credits, right? And so, all else equal, a producer keeps growing cover crops, keeps their land in no-till for a couple of decades, they're likely to lose carbon as the climate system warms, right? There's a fundamental temperature response of decomposition of organic matter, right? And so this issue of permanence is really debated in the soil science community, right? What's going on? These are complex adaptive systems where plants and microbes and the environment are interacting. And I think the scientific community doesn't necessarily agree yet on how these different processes and the climate interact. And in that same vein, I think there's really an asymmetry between the permanence of different kinds of climate solutions, right? So if we avoid emitting a molecule of nitrous oxide now, right, otherwise that molecule would have persisted for 100 years. That's the average lifetime of N2O in the atmosphere. Whereas if we store an atom of carbon in the soil, right, its residence time is likely to be much shorter. And so I think those kinds of issues are really maybe important to think about as we move further. I'm sorry, those were the ideas that had come to me during our previous round robin. And what was your question? Or I'll just pass it on. I'll pass the mic about that. Yeah. Oops, you're muted, Mark.
How many times have we heard that? What are the priorities that we need to be focused on?
Yeah, I think getting back to the context specificity of where different practices will actually gain carbon, right? I think there's obviously it's impractical, as was mentioned, to measure carbon change at the field scale. Yet we really need those kinds of models that were developed so well for erosion, for example. We need much better mechanistic models to understand where and how much carbon will change under various practices, and how carbon change and greenhouse gas emissions interact both at the field scale but at the level of the production system.
Excellent, thank you. Andy, really interested, from a farmer's perspective, we've discussed a little bit in terms of what this means for communities and farms, because it's not just the ecosystem services that the broader environment is going to experience. The farmer, the rural communities also experience this. Building up soil capacity makes it more resilient, and so you don't get maybe potentially the swings that you might see otherwise. Builds resilience to climate change and other types of aspects. So what are the opportunities? What are the real benefits moving forward? And what are some of the challenges?
Yeah, so soil and nitrogen are two things, of course, and there's some specifics there. The obvious benefit for soil is, even though we've talked about a lot of the challenges here, very, very true. We do have 26 million acres of cropland in Iowa, and that's a lot of soil. And we do have the know-how to understand, and with certain practices, conservatively speaking, we can sequester, 0.5 ton per acre with decent practices on average over large scales. And when you put that together, so 13 million tons of carbon, that's 10% of Iowa's emissions. So the opportunity is large. On the other hand, it's not the massive silver bullet, I think, that oftentimes you hear discussed. And I do want to reiterate, it's been said a couple times, but I want to really emphasize what's been mentioned already. The biggest challenge to soil carbon, in my perspective and experience, is the permanence. We had a lot more soil. We had probably 3 times as much carbon in the soil pre-settlement, pre-intensive agriculture in this state than we do now. Our soils were mollisols, prairie soils, 5% soil organic matter or greater over much of the state. Now we're at 1.5 for many of our agricultural soils. So the fact that we've lost all that suggests that we certainly could put a lot of it back. And we do have practices that can do that. But the single most important factor for losing it is tillage. And so it's been said, what's the permanence? Well, as the climate warms, you can lose some. But really, I mean, we've seen this on CRP fields. This is not new. CRP, of course, goes for 10 years. We've had farmers with CRP ground for 10 years or 2 rounds of it for 20 years. And there's been some pretty good data showing, okay, when it comes out of CRP, and if they put that back into row crops and you till it up, a friend of mine up in Northeast Iowa worked for Extension for many years, did some of this analysis on his own farm, 60 to 80% of that carbon, the additional carbon likely gained from the 10 to 20 years of CRP is gone in the first season. It's oxidized. So where's the permanence in a carbon market if we're paying farmers on a 5-year contract and then they're out? And if that contract includes, for example, no-till. On the other hand, we've had 10,000 years of tillage agriculture in this world, and it's had tremendous impacts. And the opportunity for moving beyond tillage, to me, in agriculture, when we look at beyond carbon, we have to talk beyond tillage. And that's a much bigger step than just saying, let's pay a farmer for this practice or that one or that one or that one or that one. We've got some of the greatest agricultural expertise in the world in this state, in these universities. And they were put here to help farmers farm productively, have prosperity, and meet the needs of society. And I just feel like we have a tremendous opportunity to think bigger here and think about what agriculture beyond tillage really means, and take the big research steps and the incentives and the programs to help entire communities of farmers and watersheds and landscapes move beyond tillage permanently. We have most of the techniques to do it now. My farm is permanently beyond tillage. We will never till another field, and we've been that way for 10 years. I'm not even a good farmer because I'm doing this energy work and all these other things, but we have a lot of good farmers out there who are doing this permanent no-till. And we move beyond tillage, and it's not just no-till. I mean, there's cover crops, there's all kinds of other pest management practices that go into good agriculture, but permanent no-tillage is, to me, the future, and it represents, getting back to this conversation, so many other benefits, not just, probably more valuable than just the carbon benefits when we're talking about all the other ecosystem services, flooding being one of them. If we had permanent no-till, even on half of our cropland acres in the Cedar Valley, for example, in the Upper Iowa Valley, we would never have another flood. That's how much infiltration you can have on no-tilled soils. It's 2 to 10 times as much as what we have on normal cropland soils. So no-till farming with the associated land stewardship practices, without even putting in water control structures, terraces, sediment basins, everything else, would solve the bulk of our flooding issues in Iowa, even with climate change. And I know that's a big claim, and there's no way to back it up unless or until we get there someday. But the multifunctional benefits of moving agriculture in a direction that we're talking about we need to now for climate purposes have so many other benefits for our agro ecosystems that I think that's really the bigger picture to me.
So if I could follow up real quick, you said that you're 99% of the way there. What are the barriers to permanent no-till?
Well, my farm is very small and it's not our main source of income. So we're not a good example. Ecologically, practically, I mean, we still make money on the farm. It's small, it's Christmas trees, livestock, cattle, sheep. But it's not our principal source of income. And when we're talking industrial scale agriculture, which is what agriculture is, industrial scale, our cropping systems right now are on margins and essentially run by commodity programs and payments and things like crop insurance. So I really think all of that federal structure needs to shift. Our commodities are not fundamentally market driven right now. They're price supported in so many different ways. And so you really need to get at the base of that. A certain level of carbon payment, no full-time crop farmer I know will change their practices for $20 a ton or $40 a ton. So we just need to think, we need to change the structures of the programs we're working under, and ideally they would include the carbon needs and the nitrogen needs, but be much more expansive than that.
Yeah, just to follow on to that real quick, what is the market currently? So is it $20 a ton? Is it 40? What share of income going to farms relative to what they're getting in terms of commodities?
Are you asking me that?
I was throwing that out. I was sure
Yeah,
Debbie would
or
take
if others are working in more direct carbon markets for agriculture, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell you it's anywhere in the United States from $3 to $20 a ton right now. That's CO2 equivalent, so accounts for not just soil carbon, but other forms of carbon that are being generated. And it depends on which market, because there's been a proliferation of markets right now. We don't have just typical carbon offset markets anymore. We're utilizing a market mechanism in Scope 3 supply chain reporting. That has a lower signal. It is a different purpose. It's not a carbon offset, right? So it's highly variable right now, but all trends and indications due to demand and due to scientists saying we have to do this, right? We have to increase soil carbon, we have to reduce greenhouse gases from ag, are that those prices will go up. There's an estimated $150 billion demand for carbon offsets. That's not even getting into the insets or the supply chain by 2030, right? That will drive those prices up over time, and we're already seeing them go up.
Nice.
I don't know what percentage of any farmer's income this is now. It's not high for anyone who is participating. I'll say that.
Thank you. Alejandro, given the industry that Andy was just talking about, what are the challenges within ag to move this forward?
So I think relating the solutions to the problems I mentioned, credit quality, quantity, and transparency with respect to carbon reversals, I should say that for credit quality, we need standardization of technical specifications for carbon credits and verification guidelines. Debbie mentioned that within ESMC, they have national standards, and that's undisputable. The thing is, across different programs like ESMC, NORI, Indigo Ag, Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, the standards are different. So farmers are faced with a menu of options, and it's very hard to analyze what's the best, most suitable program for them. So that's regarding credit quality. Regarding credit quantity, I say that more research is needed on how to compare the potential to generate carbon credits across models, across calculators, and more research on the appropriate mix of technologies to measure actual carbon sequestration and carbon avoidance at the farm level. So we have pretty robust idea of what the measurements from remote systems, satellite imagery, and remote sensing tell us at the landscape level, but there's a void, a gap there in the science to link those measurements, those remote measurements, with soil samples at the scale, at the farm scale level, to improve the comparability of carbon programs across commodities and across farmers. And then addressing the carbon reversals issue, I think we need more outreach from carbon programs with more details in their websites, on their marketing tools, to let people know, farmers, interesting farmers, how they will deal with carbon reversals. So it's not just about the penalties that farmers will face for reversals, carbon reversals, but also how society will can expect the carbon program to offset any carbon reversal, or how the program will deal with it, and that has to be transparent to everyone, so we can rely on the permanence of the agricultural carbon credits.
Thank you. Yeah, you brought up remote perspectives and how that can be utilized at broader scales, and particularly when we're thinking about it from a carbon perspective. But when you get into aspects such as nitrous oxide, um, how do you start to do that? Stephen, are there any indicators or anything that we should be taking a look at from a technology standpoint? Is it simply an accounting process to know how much nitrogen is going onto a field that's going to predict how much we get out of a field?
So it's a really challenging scientific problem that a lot of us are working on. Unfortunately, it's it's not easy. I mean, even to get a good carbon balance remains technically really challenging because it's a three-dimensional problem, especially in erosive landscapes. I mean, carbon is moving all directions potentially, and if you don't account for all of those flows, you're not getting a good estimate of impacts of practices on carbon change. And that's one of the reasons why there's such disagreement still in the scientific community about the the magnitude of the effect of these differing practices. So I'll give you one example for nitrous oxide. It's one of the most common methods that's currently used is based on an IPCC approach, an emission factor approach, where some percent of applied nitrogen is emitted at nitrous oxide, and yet we've seen that these are highly context dependent, yet they're applied at large scales. So the Iowa N2O emissions inventory uses a 1% emissions factor for N2O. So 1% of applied nitrogen is emitted as N2O. Work by colleagues in our own group has shown that this is 2 to 3-fold too low, right? And so that is sort of the number that we're comparing against, and that's a big deal in terms of the overall emissions. So yeah, there's a lot of science that needs to happen, but also maybe more dialogue between scientists and policymakers who have no choice but to run with the numbers that are out there.
When you say it's 2 to 3 times too low, is that place specific?
So we're, I don't, so one of our papers suggests that the fact that some of these emission factors were derived from studies on particularly well-drained soils, well, you move to, more clay-rich, carbon-rich, poor drainage capacity soils, such as that are more typical of Iowa productive farm landscapes, we see those 1% emission factors don't seem to align with empirical measurements. Yeah.
Thanks. And panelists, please feel free to jump in. I know that this is something that you all are very knowledgeable about, and if you have some thoughts and questions, please throw them in.
Yeah, I'll add on the N2O piece. So the national level emission factor is 2, right? So Iowa has picked 1/2 the national level. I do think it is valuable for us all to be comparing data, right, in what we're getting, because some organizations are taking great pains to use flux towers, eddy covariance flux towers, and our chambers on site. But N2O is highly episodic, right? It responds to temperature, it responds to moisture, thaw, freeze cycles. It's like, we just have to get a better handle. I will say some of the models actually do a pretty good job of smoothing that out and showing what we think is close to happening based on comparisons to the flux towers. So I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? We are learning more about our ability to really track it using biogeochemical process models that track daily time steps in weather, right, and follow applications. I'd like to jump in on the permanence issue. In markets, you have to account for permanence, and generally, whoever the market regulator determines how you account for permanence. So sometimes there's a buffer pool, like for every carbon credit you sell, you have to put aside 1. And if there's a reversal, you replace it. Most of the markets actually require replacement by the project developer, right? Whoever brought that carbon to market, if it goes away, you have to replace it. State of California has said the risk is on the buyer, which has really hampered offsets from growing in California. So there are different policies and mechanisms to account for reversals. One of the rules now being considered is that you can take credit for carbon as long as your soil carbon emission reductions, as long as you're permanently, in perpetuity, monitoring what happens on that field, that farm, right? That will stifle our ability to invest through market mechanisms anyway in soil carbon. On the other hand, permanence is a huge issue, right? We are never going to get to net zero if we rely on tons that may not be there in 5, 10, 20 years. And then one additional point I want to bring up that Stephen brought up is we know that as soils warm, we will lose more carbon. We have been focused on the top 6 inches or 15 centimeters of soils because that's where a lot of the activity is. We need to focus a lot more on 15 to 60 centimeters because that is where carbon is more permanent. And we do know that it can migrate down into the soil layer where we can consider it more permanent. So I think we need to do a lot more work focusing on 15 to 60 centimeters, particularly in deep-rooted systems. That is where we are going to get durability and permanence of soil carbon, not in the top 6 inches.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent. Just to keep this thought going, Emily, are there examples out there that we could bring to this discussion that would kind of inform us a little bit better?
Examples of like from other
systems,
yeah. So I think one of the things that that I think about a lot is that in Iowa we've talked for a long time, and in other parts of the U.S. about water quality, and that there's a lot of opportunities. I think to think about the data that we've generated with respect to addressing some of these other ecosystem service challenges or opportunities that we have, and really how and what we've learned from those, from trying to do that, right? And leveraging the data that we have collected, both geospatial data, so things like large scale landscape level data sets about land use and soils and hydrology, but also about how we've designed our field level research to really sort of bridge that gap, right? How do we make space for that, that field specific understanding, recognizing that we can't actually go out and sample every single field, that's not realistic, right? So I think there's opportunities to leverage some of the data that we've already generated and to certainly build on those data when we think about carbon. And also the models that we use. So folks have talked about, for example, we have done a lot of work thinking about soil erosion or about nitrate loss in our water systems, right? And those models offer opportunities to think about how we might tackle some of these carbon related questions, not only on the planning side, but also on the calculator or modeling side as well. So how do we start to make these models talk to one another and to integrate not only our data, but also the modeling, and then even more so on the economic and social side, right? So we've learned a lot about biophysical models and data. We've also learned a lot about adoption. So I think there was one of the panelists brought up this idea that farmers, we've had challenges around adoption and understanding the appropriate incentives and the appropriate policies to encourage people to adopt these practices. So how can we leverage what we've learned on that social and economic side when we think about carbon as well? So again, starting to integrate, I know Debbie talked about this, but starting to integrate across systems and across ecosystem services to really leverage multiple goals. A lot of the practices offer multiple opportunities that we're not currently capturing very efficiently.
Thank you. Yeah, could you talk a little bit more about adoption? Is it generally economically driven in terms of the feasibility? I mean, we know the margins that farms are on typically with commodity prices. Is this the main driver?
That's a great question. So Stephen talked about the uncertainty with respect to our biophysical data. And I would argue that there is equal amounts of uncertainty on the social science side and in thinking about farmer adoption and farmer decision-making and behavior change. This is not my area of expertise, so I want to put that out there right away. But there are a lot of folks who think really deeply about this. And I would say that from what I know, and others feel free to jump in here, too, it's not just about the economics. It's a much more complex decision-making process that relates to farmers' beliefs and value systems, their history and heritage on the land. So it's a much more complex process than just sort of thinking about, is the price of carbon in terms of tons advantageous to the economic bottom line that I'm trying to achieve? So I think there's a real opportunity for social science research as well as the biophysical science in this space.
Thank you. Alejandro, you do a lot of work in this space. What are the challenges to adoption or outside the system that are going to kind of shape how we move forward?
So I agree with Emily that economics is just one small part of the big number of variables that affect adoption decisions. But we have to remind ourselves that farms need to be profitable long term, unless you can inject money from another profession into farming sustainably, right, through time. and that's also a possibility. But thinking about challenges, there from outside of agriculture itself, there are many of them I can mention here. I would say that first of all, we talked about Debbie mentioned that there's plenty of demand waiting for these carbon credits to be generated and go and buy these credits. Well, there's the promise, but there's no real signal or objective signal that that demand will come to happen, that will realize. Right now, there's no signal in the market that prices will continue to go up. If we look at the European market for carbon credits, and this is a mandatory program, a mandatory system, sorry, very different from what we are seeing here in the US, outside of California and the northeastern part of the states. Voluntary markets don't have a good price discovery system. So we look at other markets, mandatory markets, and the price in those mandatory markets have been going up for 2 years. And with the invasion of Ukraine, the price dropped by 40% in just 1 week. So there's great volatility there. And there's nothing, I mean, even at this point, prices now are about 30% lower than what they were back in December 2021. So although there's this halo of growth when we talk about carbon markets, we don't have solid roots to say that these will grow. And we have to remind ourselves that in 2010, sorry, there was an experiment for about a decade that collapsed with the Chicago Climate Exchange. Thank you. So there was an attempt. There was less interest at that point in time, but there was an attempt to make these carbon credits work. Didn't work. So I'm not saying that this will be follow the same path, but we have to be careful and not to oversell what we know. And we don't have an indication that prices will go up, and we don't have an indication either that the cost for monitoring, verification, and certification or registration will go down either. One of the problems with not having standards across programs is that each program has its own standard, and that duplicates the cost for the monitoring, verification, and registration system and reporting system. So we do have high costs that put a wedge between the price paid by buyers of carbon credits and farmers who are paid, the whatever's left of that initial payment minus the cost for the MRV system. So we need to have a more efficient, first of all, a clearer MRV system, and also a more efficient one, a larger scale one, so that the unit costs could go down, so more money can be passed to the farmer. We have to be, again, very clear that the voluntary markets are very different from mandatory markets like the ones we are seeing in Europe or in California. And then we don't know about the stability of the demand for agricultural carbon credits, and agriculture is not the only sector that can provide carbon credits. So agriculture is facing and will face strong competition on the supply side from forestry, industrial carbon capture and sequestration, and so on. So agriculture has to be strategic about how much to invest, considering this external competition from other factors. And another challenge that farmers are feeling wary about is how farm data security will be managed by not just the carbon program, but the verifiers, soil test labs, and other actors in the system. So right now, there's a lot of uncertainty regarding that specific aspect, and that makes many farmers nervous. And those are all things that are coming from outside agriculture.
Thank you. Andy, Alejandro was mentioning Ukraine and the blip in terms of gas prices. And of course, Iowa is playing a role in that in terms of corn ethanol production and how that's going to be extended through summer. That probably isn't going to continue. We all know that corn ethanol does not displace any carbon. It just displaces corn production and soybean production. But as gas prices go down, again, hopefully, and EV vehicles adoption become more prevalent, what role do farms play in that? Are there other markets that they're going to get into from an energy perspective?
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, the EV issue is a politically divisive issue, but it's only divisive because of the political and ideological intentional divisions that have been sown. The farm market, right now, ethanol, of course, is an important driver, but you could argue that it's not the driver of corn prices. We had corn prices and commodity fluctuations have cyclically been there for generations and generations, and they've been caused by many different things. And ethanol has maybe or maybe not changed that long-term decadal fluctuation in commodity prices and farm profitability. But they're a wedge right now. They're a political wedge. And so they're unfortunately, for example, becoming an obstacle. The EV conversation is becoming an obstacle, for example, to large-scale solar build-outs around Iowa. We have large-scale wind right now, 10, 12 gigabytes of wind that has been 15 years in the making, and that's very important to Iowa's economy and to clean energy future. Large-scale solar could well be and should be the next generation of large-scale clean energy production in Iowa, both for domestic use as an export crop for Iowa. We have tremendous potential, even greater than wind, for large-scale solar. But of course, the political conversations are becoming an obstruction and causing local policy and anti-renewables ordinances at the county level, for example, discussions of trying to limit the growth of solar at the state level. I want to just back up for a second, tie this nitrogen conversation, though, into that solar discussion, because I think it's really relevant. First point, we've been talking about nitrous oxides, and those are a very major greenhouse gas emissions from cropland agriculture. But interestingly, the way greenhouse gas emissions are quantified in many states, including in Iowa, when you look at the Iowa DNR's annual greenhouse gas emissions report, the manufacture of those nitrogen fertilizers is over here in industry. The nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions, for example, that happen on the farm are over here in agriculture. We actually probably back of the napkin calculations on the way down we probably put more natural gas onto our cornfields from the manufacture of nitrogen than we use in the entire residential sector in this state. That's not even in the agriculture section of the emissions calculations, and it's not in much of the conversation we're having, but it's equally relevant because the same practices, again, if we're talking about nutrient management in sustainable agriculture and what are the motivations and incentives that farmers need, right now, if we apply 180 pounds of nitrogen to the acre on Iowa cornfields, and we really only need 130, and we have good data that says we could get the same level of production or at least profitability of farms out of 130 pounds of nitrogen as 180 or 200 pounds. Well, if you reduce significantly the application of nitrogen, you're reducing the emissions from the manufacturer, and you're reducing, obviously, the nitrous oxide emissions, and you're reducing the oxide emissions by a greater percentage even than the manufacturer, even than that percentage of reduction in poundage, because a greater percentage for, a portion of all the nitrogen you put on is actually uptake through the crops. So the margin of nitrous oxide emissions is higher the more you over apply. So there's that side of things that we have to look at on the nitrogen equation here. The manufacturer is a really big one. And so let's tie the manufacturer into rural prosperity just to bring this back. And I'd love to hear more from other folks too, because we had talked about what's the benefit to rural communities in decarbonizing Iowa. And most of these conversations, of course, then focus on, well, the science and profitability of nitrogen or carbon. But There's some really interesting technology out there now, small startups, but we could invest a whole lot more. And I think this will happen. I really believe this will happen in shifting the nitrogen, the ammonia fertilizer manufacture industry away from the large scale super industrialized approach it is now. And if we could decentralize that, we talk a lot about distributed everything in renewable energy. If we could distribute nitrogen manufacture with some advances in technology to where we can do that at every farmer's co-op around the state or at individual farms using Iowa renewable energy as opposed to natural gas as the energy source. Right now, natural gas is both the energy source and the hydrogen feedstock source for manufacture of ammonia fertilizer. Let's get some better technology to where we can use Iowa wind and solar to manufacture ammonia on the farm or in the county or in the community. Then all of a sudden we're reducing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the manufacture, which are huge. And we're transitioning towards a tremendous opportunity for local ownership of that renewable energy production in every county in the state. We could have just to have as much solar in Iowa as we now have wind, which is a lot. We could put 100 megawatts, more or less, in every county. That sounds like a lot. That would take a few hundred to a couple thousand acres. And then people are going to see, oh, 1,000 acres of solar panels and be really, really surprised as if the whole state's getting covered with solar panels. That's less than 0.5% of Iowa cropland. Right now, 60 to 70% of Iowa corn goes to ethanol. So to this ethanol and energy conversation, we're putting massive amounts of cropland into ethanol. We could take a tiny fraction of Iowa cropland and distribute it around the state and put it into solar and put it on mostly on the distribution grids where we don't necessarily have to build huge transmission. We do need more transmission, but we don't have to build new transmission for all of our renewables when we distribute it. We could implement policies that we're not that far from with some tweaks that would better allow for local ownership of that solar, whether it's in local utilities or in farmers co-ops, for example, just like we did with ethanol plants. That would be a tremendous prosperity engine for those local economies. It would give us clean nitrogen. And at the same time, we'd be dramatically reducing, potentially, if we have the right policies, the actual application of nitrogen onto the cropland field. So all of these things do really roll together. And of course, the ethanol is tied into it, but we don't have to depend on just intentionally moving away from ethanol. We can get there. We will get there.
Very cool. Seeing the opportunities here from a rural community perspective and the ability to generate that within the state, I mean, that's just very exciting. And so there is this mix of public and private opportunities. Emily, are there other public and private opportunities along those lines?
I mean, from a modeling or a data perspective, again, particularly on the biophysical side, we know that agricultural providers, so folks like co-ops, equipment dealers, big firms, gather a huge amount of on-farm data about agricultural production across the state. And so are there opportunities, this is just one example, to partner with those types of firms, those types of entities on a public-private scale to really help parameterize or help us understand the data and the models that we're using to, again, quantify some of these potential carbon opportunities more effectively. So are there opportunities for public-private partnership in evaluation and creation of data? I think the same could be said for models. What's the role of the public and particularly public agencies? So thinking about the role of federal agencies like USDA, for example, in helping us to bridge some of the lack of transparency in some of the calculators and the modeling tools, some of the standards, for example, that are used across these different firms or different entities. And are there ways that we can come together and actually have conversations that help us advance the carbon market and lead to better outcomes, both for farmers and for these private industries or private interests? So I guess I think there are some really nice leverage points in the system that could open doors both for private industry, private development, which feeds money into our rural economies, as well as on the public side and in the public sphere.
Awesome. Yeah, we just have a few more questions that we're going to keep asking, but please feel free to throw in your questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask from anyone in the audience. Debbie, just to follow on to that, as we've heard from Andy, and we've heard from Alejandro and everyone, this is not just a carbon question, right? I mean, there are, it sounds like a lot of opportunities. What are you guys looking at?
So I've talked about the integrated landscape-based approaches, right? And looking at not just practices, but whole systems approaches. But I think the other thing we've been doing is we've been investing a lot in new tools and technologies and ground truthing them, right? To see what works and what doesn't, because a lot of people come to us with tools and say, I have this tool that works great, look at my data. And then we look under the hood and we find out it's been calibrated and validated in one place in one part of the world and it's being used everywhere, right? That's an issue. So we spend a lot of time looking at how much ground truthing there has been of new tools and technologies, whether the remote sensing technologies or actual handheld instruments. We were investing a lot of money in that. What we have done is we've created data sets to say, here's a data set, go test it using your tool and come back and tell us what you get. And then we actually have, it's like FDA, if FDA were functioning, it's like FDA saying, prove to us that your tool technology works, right? There needs to be a lot more than that. I think there's been some discussion about the need for that. I think that's imperative, right? I cringe sometimes when I see some of the tools that are out there and I know the level of uncertainty associated with them and where and how they're being utilized, often inappropriately, right? And that really needs to be addressed. And if you're operating in a market in which there are proper rules and procedures being followed with independent third-party verification and certification, that will be addressed. But there's been a proliferation of markets where it hasn't been addressed. So we are literally just trying to leverage public dollars, private dollars. We have a lot of buyers who are investing their own money so that we can ensure that whatever tools and technologies we are building are in fact working better. And I would also say we have dropped quantification verification costs 50% from when we started 4 years ago. We set out to drop all of that 75%. And we will get there. I already see the path to that. But what it has meant is we have had to heavily invest in the tools that we are utilizing. And the benefit though of that is we're operating as an enabling platform. We're utilizing this national scale program so that others benefit. We're a nonprofit public-private partnership. We are just trying to achieve success at scale. So I think that pulls together a lot of the threads that we've brought together here is how do we collectively enable success through shared resources, through transparency, right? So that we're all learning together. We have run out of time to do things behind a curtain or independently and individually. We really need to be collaborating, building partnerships and figuring out how to do this at scale now. If we are going to address this, both the climate problem, right, but the water problem. Somebody on one of my teams recently said, and this came from General Mills, if climate is the shark, water is the teeth of the shark. And I think that's exactly right. We are only now starting to really address water, whether it's drought or high precipitation flooding events. Those are huge issues for agriculture, right? And we need to address them, and we need to address them collectively.
Yeah, speaking of a lot of these risks that are surrounding all of these topics that we've been talking about, external challenges, internal challenges, opportunities, and the diversity of opportunities. Alejandro, what are the risks and how do we mitigate some of this?
Well, I think as Debbie mentioned, by trying to expand the MRV system, the measuring, reporting, and verification system, in order to reduce costs, in order to have better guidelines, standards, science-based guidelines and standards to compare different carbon credits, trying to evaluate from a legal perspective how different actors in the value chain can deal with uncertainty. So, for example, developing risk management tools, including, for example, the verbiage or language so that can be incorporated into the contracts to balance the power between carbon programs, buyers, and farmers. Evaluating the possibility of developing tools to manage risk in the production of carbon credits, similar to what we have for crop production, managing risks of some companies exiting the market. So if there's growth in agreement on how to generate, evaluate, and transact carbon credits, then probably some of the smallest carbon programs will have to merge with larger carbon programs, and or exit the market because of costs, basically. And that will generate a problem for those farmers that are enrolled in those smaller carbon programs. So how to deal with that is important, just to provide, risk management tools. Also, we've also mentioned that USDA through NRCS is providing multiple pathways to support soil testing, to support conservation practice adoption, and so on. Well, some carbon programs don't allow for stacking payments or cost share with carbon payments because of additionality, but maybe we can find ways in which USDA can collaborate. If USDA is interested in expanding this carbon market, maybe USDA can provide costs, can cover costs to do the soil tests for every farmer interested in participating in this market, or maybe not. I don't know, but trying to explore new ideas and evaluating the cost and benefits for different players and for taxpayers, right? That's very important going forward. And that's a discussion that I have not really seen.
And just to follow on to that, and this is from a question from the audience, you talked about potential threats from other sectors, other industries. Is there a threat to Iowa in terms of, based on what Debbie said, it's not likely not going to be California, but what if other states start to encourage or allow through policy for markets to significantly develop in other areas? Is that going to leave Iowa behind, for instance, or what are the threats potentially?
I would like to mention that the major threat from agricultural production is not from within the United States, it's Asia, it's the international market. I mean, the potential to sequester carbon in other parts of the world, think of the Amazon, are huge. So, it's not one state competing against another state in the US, is agriculture in the US competing against agriculture outside of the US, which is very large, against forestry in the US and outside of the US, industrial methods to capture and sequester carbon in the US and outside of the US. So, carbon and greenhouse gases are a global issue, and maybe becoming the first in the state, in the nation, to lead the development of a well-functioning carbon market is great, but as long as we are not second to some other place in another part of the world becoming the leader in carbon markets.
So what's the impact on Iowa then, if internationally that they become the leader?
There are many ways in which, many pathways I see for other countries to become leaders first, because the cost structure in US dollars is much lower in other parts of the world. The credibility could be lower too, right? But the threat is that if agricultural carbon credits end up being a niche market because other industries are able to provide a more credible carbon credits, more permanent, more easily verifiable carbon credits, let's say forestry or industrial carbon sequestration, then the demand for agricultural carbon credits will try to siphon out all the cheapest carbon credits in the world. Why care where they are coming from? This is a global balance of greenhouse gases that we care about. The companies don't really need to report that they are going to achieve their carbon neutrality or carbon negativity in their ESG reports by buying carbon credits from a specific part of the world. I think stakeholders wouldn't care much about that, as long as the credibility of those carbon credits are comparable.
Yeah, I'd just like to add there's actually supply chain ESG reporting that literally requires companies to track their emission reductions within their supply chain for the commodities they buy. So the entire food and beverage sector has to track and reduce their agricultural emissions within the supply chain in the regions where they source product. So that is the market we are working in, is the scope through supply chain market. We don't work in the offset market. That is difficult. It does require different accounting and reporting. And it does require that they stay within their supply chains and purchase and intervene only in agriculture. That is a game changer. And when we did our market assessment of what the demand looked like, we did this in 2018. The demand within the United States alone was $13.9 billion within supply chains. And we have seen that only go up, because since then, the number of companies that have made net zero commitments within their agricultural supply chain has gone up 75%. So there are different markets and market mechanisms that we should tap here. I would say the other thing, and this addresses a lot of the concerns you've raised, Alejandro, is offsets allow emissions to be increased elsewhere, right? So you're literally not reducing emissions in total, but within supply chain reporting or insets, they're absolute emission reductions. You are not allowing emissions to go up elsewhere. So an emission reduction is an emission reduction because you're not allowing something to be offset. So within that new paradigm of supply chain reporting, there's huge opportunity, and it's the only way we will get to net zero.
I agree with you, Debbie, and insets are a big issue, but insets, once we have a large, let's say all the food companies working on that, insets are calculated in a way that if you reduce the emissions in agriculture, then it reduces the carbon calculations for the entire value chain. So there are many companies that can claim the same reduction in carbon in the agricultural sector for their own benefit. So the same inset can be claimed by many companies, and therefore I think it's a great tool, but it's not the only tool. And well, the value of insets usually, as far as I know, usually is much lower than the value of offsets. And offsets are not always completely used to offset actual new emissions. Sometimes they could be used to generate negative reduction, a net reduction in carbon emissions for a particular company.
Yeah, I'll just respond. So there can be sharing of emission factors in a supply chain only if the companies can show that they actually co-purchase the product. So if cattle is produced and you create an inset and two companies buy the same product, right? Then you can share that emission factor. So we are actually working on global systems for tracking that to ensure appropriate double counting, but not inappropriate double counting. And I actually think this is the market of the future and the only way we're going to get to net zero. So I think there's lots of opportunities, and I think a lot of the challenges have been brought up here. And I'm glad to see so many people talking about it and helping to address it as well.
Thank you. Yeah, this is very interesting. With the last few minutes, I just wanted to come back to Stephen and Emily just for a second and talk a little bit about the science. Where does the science have to go from here? Any thoughts?
I think we've hit a lot on sort of the need to link measurements and models at multiple scales and to account for the full life cycle. Just circling back a little in the fascinating discussion that's happened, back to Andrew's point on clean ammonia. I think that's that's absolutely revolutionary, and that's one end of the spectrum. Another end is to think more creatively and go backwards, right, to extended crop rotations. Incorporating biological nitrogen fixation, forage legumes into our systems again. We may not see huge changes in soil carbon, but if we look at the whole life cycle perspective, right, dramatically reducing fossil energy inputs at the same, and all of these co-benefits for biodiversity and for water quality. So that's maybe another wrinkle on it. But and then to the fascinating sort of comparison between forestry carbon credits versus agriculture, I think there the sort of uncertainty and permanence is maybe even more marked in the case of forestry systems, where fire, droughts, pests wipe out the whole system right within a season. And so in that context, agriculture might seem more of a good bet. So pass it to Emily.
Yeah, I agree with Stephen in sort of the things we've talked about. I think the only other thing that I would add is that if you look at the practices that are often associated with reductions in emissions, there's a huge standard deviation around the science that we understand for each one of those practices. So for example, if you would change your fertilizer application, or you would use cover crops, or pick your other host of best management practice, I think we still have a lot to learn about both the carbon side and certainly the nitrous oxide side of those equations. And again, what we do know, I think, is there are challenges around geographies, just like we've already talked about here. So we might have data about those practices in very different locations, in very different landscape positions. And so trying to understand those and tighten the standard deviations around some of those practices, again, really thinking about what the impact really is, I think is another area of a lot of importance as we kind of move forward.
Thanks. And maybe just to finish us off, Andy, what do farmers, not that you know all farmers' opinion, what are some thoughts in terms of coming from farmers in terms of what we need to do that?
What you need to do better, or what we as a society need to do better?
We as a society, we as a state.
Yeah, I do think there's, I actually, in a lot of my sustainable ag conversations, I often hesitate to put too much emphasis on the Farm Bill, but I do think, the Farm Bill is coming up next year for renewal. So those conversations are really happening. And I think if you take a long view, with a short view, who knows what's going to happen and what kind of jockeying is happening, who the senators are, who the leaders are in Congress right now. But you take the long view on the Farm Bill and our societal commitment to land stewardship with working landowners, working lands, private land stewardship, and those landowners has really evolved over the last couple generations. And again, you can go back to the 85 Farm Bill as a real turning point probably, but every Farm Bill 5 years roughly since then has had some pretty unique pieces to it. And in the current climate, around climate, as well as many other issues, global food supplies right now, challenges we're going to be looking at maybe for some time. I think the evolution of federal policy, and with it state policy, towards land stewardship has a lot of potential. And I think we all could engage in that to the degree where, towards the end goal of a more unified and stronger payment of support for land stewardship commodities, for ecosystem services in the federal funds that flow to agriculture. So we've had tens of billions typically every year for a couple generations going more towards what we think of as subsidies or price supports or insurance, those kind of payments, countercyclical payments. And we've had just a few, couple maybe billion in financial assistance towards the conservation side of things. But there's been a strong and growing movement and support, even politically, of shifting that balance. So if we want to have a societal safety net for farmers and farm communities, we're not just talking about farmers here. We have way fewer farmers than we've ever had, right? But we do have farm communities throughout Iowa still. And if we want to have a relationship between public policy and rural America and farmers and farm communities based on the flow of funds in some form of a safety net or other, if the bulk of those funds flowed for conservation and stewardship benefits, we really could put together a lot of these. We could stack these issues. We could have much more. We could have payments with greater integrity and security. And all of these benefits could come together to where we're not so much relying on the quantification of this ton of carbon on that field or that pound of nitrogen on that field, but we're looking at whole suites of practices and moving the agricultural systems together as a whole. And I think there's a lot of potential there for that. It does mean the science needs to get synthesized and not everything is going to function as it should on every acre, but as a whole, the Farm Bill could move in that direction. Farm support and stewardship payments could move in that direction. And I really think the impacts both on rural communities and on our ecosystems could be really tremendous. And that won't all happen next year. But if we keep working on it over these successional farm bills, over this generation that we're in, we could really transform public policy, and that could really help transform land management throughout the country.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. I appreciate your inputs, and I just want to say to all of our panelists, I very much appreciate you guys taking your times. This was incredibly informative. Debbie, being able to take your time, even at the airport, so I appreciate it. All of you, thank you so much for your support and information and knowledge. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good
Okay.
conversation.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.